In the autumn of 1842, the people of New York City gathered by the tens of thousands to celebrate the arrival of something we turn on without a thought 100 times a day. Water. Clean water. It had come to them down a brick tunnel 41 miles long, from a river up in the countryside of Westchester County, and it had made that entire journey, every foot of those 41 miles, without a single pump. No steam engine pushed it. No machine lifted it. The water walked itself into the greatest city in America on nothing but gravity, falling so gently along that hand-built tunnel that it dropped only about 13 inches for every mile it traveled, a slope so slight you could barely see it, engineered so precisely by hand that the water flowed the whole way down and arrived 22 hours later in the heart of Manhattan. And when it came, it saved the city. Because before that water arrived, New York was a place that was dying of thirst in the middle of plenty, a city where people drank filth, where cholera came in waves and killed by the thousands, and where a fire could burn for days because there was no clean water to fight it with. I have walked long stretches of that old aqueduct, which still runs south through Westchester as a quiet trail, and the thing that stays with me is how much of it was done by hand, by men whose names almost no one bothered to write down. 3, maybe 4,000 Irish immigrants dug that tunnel, blasted through the rock, and lined the whole 41 miles with brick for about $1 a day. When the contractors cut their pay, they went on strike, and the answer to their strike was the militia. One name did come down to us, a man named George Law, who arrived in this country with nothing, worked as a common laborer and a stonemason on projects like this one, and rose to become one of the contractors who built the aqueduct's greatest structure, the high bridge across the Harlem River. He rose. The thousands who dug beside him did not, and they are the men this is really about. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back. Because this is the story of how a desperate, dirty, thirsty city reached 41 miles into the countryside and pulled a river to itself, by hand, and changed forever what a modern city could be. To understand why New York would attempt something so enormous, you have to understand how bad things had gotten. By the 1830s, New York was the biggest and fastest growing city in the country, but it was still drinking essentially the way a village drinks, from local wells and ponds and a few private water companies, and the water was foul. The city sat on a small island, and its wells were shallow and increasingly poisoned by the waste of a crowded population, by privies and graveyards, and the runoff of the streets. The most famous water source, a pond called the Collect, had become so polluted it had to be filled in. People who could afford it bought water carted in from the countryside. Everyone else drank what they could get, and what they could get was making them sick. It is worth understanding just how strange and inadequate the old arrangements were, because it tells you how desperate the city had become. For most of its history, New York had drunk from wells sunk into the island itself, and from a few ponds, the largest of which was a body of fresh water near what is now the courts and city hall, called the Collect Pond. But as the city grew, it fouled its own water with terrifying speed. The Collect became a dumping ground, ringed by tanneries and slaughterhouses and privies, until it was so polluted and stinking that the city finally filled it in entirely and built over it. People with money bought their drinking water from carts, water hauled in barrels from cleaner springs in the countryside, and sold through the streets by the pailful, an everyday expense for anyone who could manage it. There had even been an attempt at a private solution that turned into one of the great swindles of the era. Back in 1799, a company had been chartered, supposedly to supply the city with fresh water. But its real purpose, buried in the fine print by its founder, the politician Aaron Burr, was to use the water charter as a cover to start a bank. The company laid a few wooden pipes and delivered poor water to a fraction of the city while the bank flourished, and New York's water problem went right on getting worse. So by the 1830s, the situation was genuinely dire. A great commercial city, one of the busiest ports on earth, could not give its own people a clean drink of water, and the private schemes and the shallow wells had all failed. The only thing left to try was something on a completely different scale. A public work so large it would have to be paid for and built by the city itself, reaching far off the island to find water clean enough and plentiful enough to matter. It was that, or keep dying. And then came the two disasters that finally forced the issue. In 1832, a cholera epidemic swept through New York and killed thousands of people in a matter of weeks. Cholera is a waterborne disease, though they did not fully understand that yet, and it thrives exactly where clean water is scarce and human waste is not kept away from what people drink. The city was a perfect breeding ground for it. And then, in December of 1835, a fire broke out in Lower Manhattan in the dead of a brutally cold winter. And because there was not enough water, and because the water there was froze in the hydrants and the cisterns, the fire could not be stopped. It burned through the night and destroyed hundreds of buildings, much of the commercial heart of the city, one of the worst fires in American history. Disease was killing the city slowly. Fire could kill it all at once, and both disasters pointed at the same missing thing. New York did not have water, and it was going to have to go and get it, no matter how far away it was. Let me put those two catastrophes in front of you plainly, because together they broke the city's will to keep muddling along. The cholera epidemic of 1832 arrived in the summer and turned New York into a place of terror. Cholera kills fast and horribly, and in the weeks it raged, those who could afford to flee the city did, emptying whole neighborhoods, while the poor, who could not leave and who drank the worst water, died in the thousands. No one yet understood that the disease traveled in filthy water, but everyone could see that it struck hardest exactly where the water and the sanitation were worst. And then 3 years later, in the middle of a savage December cold snap in 1835, fire broke out in the heart of Lower Manhattan, in the district of warehouses and merchant houses that was the engine of the city's wealth. The firefighters came, but the cold was so extreme that the water in the cisterns and the hydrants and even the rivers had frozen, and there was simply not enough water to fight the flames. The fire burned out of control through the night and into the next day and consumed hundreds of buildings, gutting a huge part of the commercial city, one of the most destructive fires the country had ever seen. Between them, the epidemic and the fire delivered the same verdict from two directions. A city without water could be killed slowly by disease or quickly by fire, and New York had just suffered both. After that, the enormous cost and difficulty of reaching 40 miles north for clean water stopped looking like an extravagance and started looking like survival. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. The place they decided to get it was the Croton River, up in Westchester County, more than 40 miles to the north. They would dam the Croton to make a great reservoir, and then they would carry its water all the way down to the city. But how do you move that much water 41 miles in the 1830s, with no electricity and no practical way to pump such a volume across such a distance? The answer the engineers chose was as old as the Romans and as elegant as anything in engineering. They would let gravity do all of it. If the water started high enough at the Croton end, and if the tunnel that carried it descended at a perfectly steady, gentle grade the entire way, then the water would simply flow downhill, on its own, forever, 41 miles to Manhattan, using no power at all except the pull of the earth. But that idea, simple as it sounds, hides a staggering demand for precision. The tunnel could not just slope downhill in general. It had to descend at a controlled, continuous rate the whole way, because if any stretch went downhill too steeply, the water would race and then pool, and if any stretch went even slightly uphill, the water would stop dead. Across 41 miles of real country, of hills and valleys and rivers and rock, the engineers had to hold the floor of that tunnel to a fall of only about 13 inches per mile, roughly the width of a forearm of drop across a whole mile of ground. To do that, they had to survey the entire route by hand with the instruments of the day and then build the tunnel to follow that invisible, gently falling line, no matter what the land did, cutting through hills where the land rose too high, and building the tunnel up onto great embankments and across bridges where the land fell away too low. The chief engineer who saw this through was a largely self-taught man named John B. Jervis, who had come up through the ranks on the Erie Canal, and the precision his teams achieved by hand, holding that thread of a grade across 41 miles of wilderness, is one of the quiet miracles of American engineering. Think about what that precision demanded of men working with the tools of the 1830s. There were no lasers, no satellites, no engines. To find and hold that gently falling line across 41 miles, the surveyors went over the entire route on foot, with levels and transits and measuring chains, shooting their sight lines and driving their stakes, establishing the exact height of the tunnel floor at point after point across hills and swamps and river valleys, and doing it accurately enough that water would flow the whole way. A single sustained error, a stretch built a little too high, would have created a place where the water slowed and stopped, and the entire aqueduct would have failed. This was the same fundamental idea the Romans had used 2,000 years earlier to water their cities. The gravity aqueduct. Water carried great distances on a carefully maintained downward grade, and the Croton engineers knew it and consciously reached back to that ancient tradition, right down to the look of their bridges. But the Romans had built with the labor of a vast empire and slaves beyond counting. The Croton was built by a young republic in about 5 years, by a few thousand immigrant laborers under a largely self-taught chief engineer, and it worked. When John B. Jervis finally let the water in and it flowed the full 41 miles and arrived, on schedule, in the city, it was the vindication of an enormous, invisible act of precision, thousands of measurements and decisions, all holding true across the whole length of the line. We do not often think of surveying as heroic. On the Croton, it was. Now, let me tell you about the tunnel itself, the actual thing they built, because it is not what most people picture. It was not a pipe. It was a masonry conduit, a tunnel of brick and stone that a person could walk through, shaped in cross-section a little like an egg standing on its narrower end, or a horseshoe, about 8.5 feet high and 7.5 feet wide on the inside. The whole length of it was lined with brick, millions upon millions of bricks, laid by hand. Where the ground was high, the conduit ran underground, cut, and often blasted through solid rock. Where the ground was low, it ran along the top of massive earthen embankments so that it never lost its precious downward grade. And every mile or so along its length, they built a ventilating tower, a stone shaft rising 10 or 20 feet, to let air move through the tunnel and to give access to it. The water ran through this brick channel in the dark, silent, steady, dropping its 13 inches a mile. On, day and night, 35 million gallons of it a day by the time the system was running, at a walking pace of under 2 miles an hour, taking about 22 hours to make the full trip from the Croton Dam to the city. A river, tamed and roofed over and set, walking downhill through a tunnel to a city that was dying without it. Building that brick channel across 41 miles of country was itself a monumental labor, repeated over and over for the whole length of the line. Where the tunnel ran underground, crews had to dig the trench and, again, blast their way through solid rock with hand-drilled holes packed with black powder, one of the most dangerous jobs on the entire project. Where the land dropped away, they had to raise huge embankments of earth and stone to carry the tunnel across at the right height, moving mountains of fill by cart and wheelbarrow and shovel. And through all of it, the conduit had to be built up in brick and stone masonry, its floor and its curving walls and its arched top laid by hand, which meant that millions upon millions of bricks had to be made, hauled to the line, and set in mortar, course after course, for 41 miles. The ventilating towers went up every mile or so, stone shafts that let air circulate and gave access for inspection and repair. It was not a single dramatic structure like a great bridge or a monument. It was the same demanding masonry work, done to the same exacting grade, repeated tens of thousands of times along a line that ran the length of a whole county. The sheer relentless repetition of skilled, hard labor over 5 years and 41 miles is part of what makes it so easy to overlook, and part of what makes the men who did it so worth remembering. There was no glory in laying the 10,000th foot of brick tunnel. There was only the work and the water it would someday carry. Before I go on, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click. Come back. Because now I want to take you down into that tunnel while it was being built and introduce you to the men who actually dug it, because that is where this stops being about engineering and starts being about people. The aqueduct was dug, blasted, and bricked over almost entirely by hand, and the hands were overwhelmingly Irish. This was the 1830s and early 40s, the years when Irish immigrants were pouring into America, many of them fleeing poverty and, soon, famine. And they took the work that was hardest and most dangerous and worst paid, the work of digging America's canals and railroads and aqueducts, out of the raw ground. Somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 of them worked on the Croton Aqueduct. They lived in rough shanty camps strung out along the line of the work, moving as the work moved, in conditions that were miserable and unhealthy. And they did the labor that the finished marble city would never see or remember. They swung the picks and shovels that cut the channel. They drilled and set the black powder that blasted it through rock. They mixed the mortar and laid the brick that lined it, mile after mile. And they did it for about $1 a day. I want to slow down on those men because they are the beating heart of this and the part most likely to be forgotten. The Irish who dug the Croton were part of the first great wave of Irish immigration to America, men driven across the ocean by poverty and hunger in Ireland, arriving in a country that wanted their muscle and little else. They were very often despised by the settled population, met with suspicion and open prejudice, and funneled into exactly the kind of work no one else would do, the wet, dangerous, backbreaking labor of digging the young nation's infrastructure out of the ground. On the Croton, they lived in shanty settlements strung along the line of the work, rough shelters they threw up themselves, moving on as the digging advanced, with their families sometimes alongside them. Sanitation in those camps was poor, and disease, the very kind of waterborne sickness the aqueduct was meant to cure, moved through them, and the work itself could kill you in an instant. Setting and firing black powder to blast rock, with the crude fuses and uncertain timing of the era, meant that premature blasts and flying stone maimed and killed men on projects like this all the time. Cave-ins, falling rock, the ordinary hazards of moving enormous weights by hand, all of it took its steady toll. These were not soft men, and they did not expect an easy life. But the price they paid to build the city's water was real, and it was paid in bodies as well as sweat, and the city that drank the result mostly did not want to think about the shanties, or the blasting, or the graves at all. And here is a piece of it that I think matters enormously, because it punctures the pretty story. In 1840, the contractors decided to cut the workers' pay from $1 a day down to 75 cents. The men who were building the thing that would save the city, living in shanties and breathing rock dust and risking their lives with black powder, were told they would now be paid a quarter less for it. And they did what workers have always done when pushed too far. They went on strike. They refused to work. And the response of the authorities was not to negotiate, it was to call out the militia, armed soldiers, to break the strike and force the men back to the work. That is the part the celebrations left out. The clean water that 100,000 New Yorkers cheered in 1842 was dug by men who had been marched back to their picks at the point of the militia's bayonets when they dared to ask not to have their poverty. Wages cut. Remember that when I get to the fountains and the parades. And the strike was not a small thing, or a quiet one. Picture it, thousands of laborers, spread along miles of open country, deciding together that they would not accept the cut, laying down their tools, refusing to dig. For men that poor, with families in the shanties depending on the wage, a strike was a desperate gamble, because a day not worked was a day not eaten. They did it anyway, because a quarter cut out of $1 was the difference between just surviving and not surviving at all. And the response tells you exactly where these men stood in the eyes of the society they were building for. There was no arbitration, no negotiation, no sense that men who did the hardest and most dangerous work in the state had earned a hearing. There was the militia, armed force, called out to protect the schedule and the budget of the great public work by breaking the will of the men who were building it. The strike was put down, the men went back to the picks and the powder at the reduced wage, and the tunnel went on toward the city. I dwell on this not to spoil the achievement, but because you cannot understand the achievement honestly without it. The clean water was real, and it was a genuine gift to the city. But it was extracted from these men at least as much as it was given by them, and both of those things are true at the same time, and only one of them got remembered. And I do not want to leave those men as an abstraction, a number, 3,000 or 4,000 Irish. So let me put you beside them for a moment in the actual work. A day on the Croton was pick and shovel and barrow, hour after hour, in all weather. Where the line ran through earth, the men cut the channel by hand, loosening the ground with picks, lifting it out with shovels, wheeling it away in barrows up planks to be dumped, and then doing it again and again, foot by foot, for their $1. Where the line hit rock, the work turned deadly. A man would hold a steel drill against the stone while another swung a sledge to strike it, turning the drill a little between blows, driving a hole into solid rock by main force and repetition, and into that hole went the black powder and the fuse and everyone who could took cover. And if the charge went as planned, the rock shattered and the men went in to clear it. And if it did not go as planned, a man died. Then the masons came behind, and the same men or others mixed mortar and carried brick, and laid the curving walls of the conduit, kneeling in the wet channel, setting brick after brick to the exact line the engineers had marked. It was cold, filthy, dangerous, monotonous, and unrelenting, and it went on for 5 years, across 41 miles. The finished aqueduct is silent and clean and invisible, water sliding through brick in the dark. The making of it was mud and black powder and the endless ache of muscle, paid by the day, mostly to men whose only record in this world is that the water still runs. One quick note, I turned the full story into a book, everything the records gave me. If you want it, the link is in the description. There was one man among all those laborers whose name did survive, and his story is worth telling precisely because it is the exception that proves the rule. George Law was an immigrant who came to this work with nothing, an ordinary young man who took a job as a common laborer and stonemason on public works like the canals and the aqueduct, swinging tools and laying stone alongside everyone else. But Law was ambitious and shrewd, and he clawed his way up from laborer to contractor, from the man swinging the hammer to the man who won the contracts and hired the crews. And he rose high enough that in 1839, when the city sought a builder for the aqueduct's single most difficult and spectacular structure, the great bridge that would have to carry the water across the wide valley of the Harlem River, the contract went to a partnership that included George Law. The man who had started as a laborer on the aqueduct ended up building its crown. He would go on from there to become genuinely wealthy, a major figure in steamships and railroads and New York affairs. His rise is a real and stirring American story, but I want you to hold it in the right frame. George Law rose out of the labor. The 3,000 or 4,000 other men who dug and blasted and bricked that tunnel beside him did not rise. They finished the work, and they moved on to the next hard job, and the record swallowed their names whole. For every George Law, there were thousands whose only monument is the water itself. It is worth understanding how unusual Law's rise really was, and how it worked, because it throws the others into sharper relief. In that era, the great public works were built through a chain of contractors. The city and its engineers designed the aqueduct and then let out the actual construction in sections to contractors, men who bid to build a given stretch and then hired the laborers to do it. A common laborer earned his $1 a day and no more. A contractor who ran a section, who took the risk and organized the work, could make real money, and a shrewd, tough, ambitious man who understood the work from the bottom could climb from one rung to the next, from laborer to foreman to subcontractor to contractor. That is the ladder George Law climbed, and he climbed it fast and hard until he was bidding on and winning the contract for the greatest structure on the whole line. It was a genuine achievement, and it was also the exception the system produced to prove that a ladder existed at all. For that ladder to lift one George Law to wealth, thousands of others had to stand on the bottom rung and stay there, digging, so that there was a bottom for the ladder to rest on. Law's success was real. It simply was not available to most of the men beside him, and their staying at the bottom was not a personal failing. It was the design. The bridge Law helped build, the High Bridge, deserves its own moment, because it is the most beautiful thing in the whole system, and the clearest echo of the ancient world. When the aqueduct reached the Harlem River, the water faced a wide, deep valley it had to cross without losing its grade. The grand solution, the one they eventually built, was a great stone bridge marching across the valley on a row of tall masonry arches, 15 of them in the original design, so that from a distance it looked exactly like a Roman aqueduct transplanted to 19th century New York, which is precisely what it was meant to evoke. Across the top of those arches ran the great iron pipes that carried the water. The High Bridge took years to complete and did not open until 1848, 6 years after water first reached the city. And in the meantime, the water crossed the Harlem Valley through pipes laid across a lower temporary structure. But when the High Bridge was finished, New York had its own Roman monument, a thing of pure engineering that was also, frankly, one of the handsomest structures in America, and it still stands today. The oldest bridge in New York City, having carried first water and later people across the Harlem for well over a century, I have stood under those arches, and they really do stop you, because they are so deliberately, unashamedly Roman. The men who built the Croton system were educated in a world that revered classical antiquity, and when they came to the grandest problem on the line, carrying the water across the wide Harlem Valley without breaking its grade, they reached straight back to the aqueducts of ancient Rome for the answer and the form. A long line of tall stone arches marching across the valley, holding the water channel up on top, exactly as Roman engineers had carried water into their own capital nearly 2,000 years before. It was engineering, but it was also a statement. A young American city announcing that it too could build like an empire, that it belonged in the same story as Rome. Building it was slow and expensive, and it was not finished until 1848. So for the first 6 years, the water actually crossed the Harlem through iron pipes laid over a lower, cheaper temporary crossing while the Great Bridge rose beside it, arch by arch. When it was done, New York had a genuine monument, a structure that was purely functional and yet so handsome that people came simply to look at it and to walk the high pedestrian promenade the builders set along the top, far out across the river and high above it. And it endured. Long after the water stopped flowing across it, the high bridge remained, and it stands today as the oldest bridge in the whole city, a Roman ghost in the middle of the modern metropolis, still carrying people as it once carried a river. But the river did not give up its water without a fight, and the aqueduct's builders learned that the hard way. In January of 1841, with the great work well underway, a violent winter storm hit the Croton Valley, and the swollen river tore into the dam they were building to hold the reservoir. The dam failed, and a wall of water went down the Croton Valley, destroying property and taking lives in the flood. It was a brutal reminder that they were not just building a tunnel, they were trying to seize and control a living river, and the river was more than willing to kill them for it. They rebuilt. They always rebuilt. But the flood of 1841 is one more thing the fountains and the speeches did not dwell on. The price the river extracted before it agreed to be tamed. It is worth going all the way up to the source for a moment, to the far end of the line, because the aqueduct began with an act of seizing a river. Up in the hills of northern Westchester, the engineers dammed the Croton River to pond its water into a great reservoir, a man-made lake that would serve as the still, deep head of the whole system, the reservoir from which the water would begin its long fall to the city. Making that lake meant drowning land. The rising water backed up behind the dam and covered farms and fields and mills and roads that had been there for generations, flooding a stretch of the valley to create the supply, an early instance of a pattern that would repeat again and again as growing cities reached out to take the water of the countryside. The people of the valley gave up their land so the people of the city could drink, a bargain they had little say in. And it was that first dam, still unfinished and untested, that the January storm of 1841 tore apart, sending the pent-up water crashing down the valley in the flood I described. They built it back, larger and stronger, and the reservoir filled, and the Croton became, in effect, a captive river. Its water no longer running free to the Hudson, but diverted into a brick tunnel and marched south to Manhattan. We tend to picture the aqueduct as the tunnel and the bridge and the fountains, but it started here, with a dam and a drowned valley and a river taken and turned 41 miles from the city that would drink it. And then, at last, it was done, and the water came. On a June morning in 1842, they let the Croton water into the head of the aqueduct, and it began its slow 22-hour walk south, and men rowed along beside it. Some of them in a small boat floating on the current inside the tunnel itself, escorting the water down toward the city like a procession. There is something wonderful, and a little comic, about that first passage. The men wanted to be present for the water's arrival, to witness the thing they had labored years to build actually work, and so a small boat, which they called the Croton Maid, was put into the tunnel at the upper end and floated down on the very first flow, carried along inside the dark brick channel by the same gentle current that carried the water, a handful of men riding the new river through its own tunnel down toward the city. Above ground, riders and crowds followed the water's progress south over the days it took to arrive, town by town, as word ran ahead that the Croton was coming. It was a slow-motion triumph, a river visibly, deliberately walking itself into a city over the course of a day, escorted the whole way by the people who could hardly believe it was really happening. By the time it reached the reservoirs and the taps, and at last leapt up out of the fountains, the whole city had been following it for days, and the celebration was less a single event than the climax of a long and giddy watching. It filled the Great Receiving Reservoir up in what is now Central Park, a reservoir holding 180 million gallons, and then the distributing reservoir down at what was then the edge of the city at 42nd Street and 5th Avenue, a strange and monumental structure with sloping Egyptian-style walls and a promenade on top where New Yorkers would stroll and admire the view. That reservoir stood on the exact ground where the great marble New York Public Library and Bryant Park sit today. And on the 14th of October, 1842, the city held a celebration that stopped everything. There was a parade miles long, church bells rang and cannon fired. And in the fountain at City Hall Park, the new Croton water was set loose to leap 50 feet straight up into the air. A tower of clean water spouting up out of the ground in the middle of Manhattan, and the crowds went, by every account, a little bit mad with joy at the sight of it. The whole city gave itself over to that celebration in a way that is hard to imagine now, when water is the least remarkable thing in our lives. The great parade that marched through the streets stretched for miles and took hours to pass, rank after rank of firemen and tradesmen and societies and officials, because everyone wanted to be part of it. Everyone understood that something fundamental about the city had just changed. Poems were written for the occasion, songs were sung, medals were struck. The Croton water became, for a season, the thing everyone was talking about, and the reservoirs where it collected became attractions in their own right. The distributing reservoir down at 42nd Street, with its high-sloping walls built in a severe Egyptian style, had a broad promenade around its top, and fashionable New Yorkers made a habit of strolling up there to take the air and look out over the growing city and the water that now served it. It is genuinely strange and wonderful to realize that people once treated a municipal reservoir as a place to go for a pleasant Sunday walk, but they did, because the water was still a marvel to them, still new, still the thing that had saved them. And the sites themselves went on to extraordinary afterlives. The Great Receiving Reservoir up in the park was eventually drained and filled and became the great lawn of Central Park, where New Yorkers now picnic and play ball on ground that once held 180 million gallons of Croton water. The distributing reservoir was torn down at the end of the century, and on its exact footprint rose the marble New York Public Library, with Bryant Park behind it. The water moved on, but the places it had touched became some of the most cherished ground in all of New York. They had water. After all the filth and the cholera and the fire, they had clean, abundant, endless water, and it had come to them from 41 miles away on nothing but the tilt of the land. What that water did to New York is almost impossible to overstate. It did not just quench thirst, it made the modern city possible. With abundant clean water, the worst of the waterborne epidemics could finally be fought. With water in the hydrants, fires could be controlled. With water in the pipes, the city could build sewers and baths, and indoor plumbing could grow upward and outward into the metropolis it became. Historians of the city will tell you flatly that New York could not have become New York without the Croton water, and the change reached right into people's homes and bodies. Once the water was in the city reservoirs, it could be piped out through the streets and, for those who could afford it, into buildings. And that single fact began to transform daily life. Indoor running water, bathrooms, the flushing of waste out of the house through pipes instead of into a backyard privy, all of it became possible on a scale it never had been before, first for the well-off, and gradually for more of the city. Public baths and street hydrants brought at least some clean water within reach of the poor. The fire companies, for the first time, could count on water in the mains to fight a blaze. And the health of the whole city slowly began to change, as clean water in place of foul cut into the endless toll of the waterborne diseases that had haunted the crowded streets. It did not happen all at once, and New York would suffer more epidemics and more fires before its water and its sewers were truly modern. But the direction had changed. Before Croton, the city's growth was throttled by its own filth, a place that poisoned and burned faster than it could build. After Croton, the city had the one thing a great metropolis cannot do without, and around that abundant clean water, it could finally build upward and outward into the future. The whole colossal future of the place, everything that came after, rested on a brick tunnel full of water walking quietly downhill. And the reservoirs became landmarks in their own right, the receiving reservoir eventually giving way to the great lawn of Central Park, the distributing reservoir giving way to the public library, so that even the places where the water paused on its journey became some of the most beloved ground in the city. And the Croton did something even larger than saving New York from thirst and fire. It proved a point that would echo through the rest of the century, that a modern city could deliberately reach far beyond its own borders, seize a distant source of clean water, and pipe it home on a scale not attempted since the ancient world. Other American cities watched and followed. Within New York itself, the original Croton system, mighty as it was eventually outgrown by the exploding population it had helped create. And later in the century, the city built an even larger new Croton aqueduct alongside the old one. And later, still reached all the way to the distant Catskill Mountains, building one of the greatest water supply systems on Earth. The system that still fills the glass in every New York apartment today. But it all began with that first brick tunnel and its 13-inch grade and its army of Irish hands. The old aqueduct still lies there under the ground, its long line now a public trail that runs for miles south through Westchester. A green path where people walk their dogs and jog in the evening, most of them with no idea that a few feet beneath their shoes runs the brick channel that made the modern city possible, or that it was laid, brick by men the city hired, underpaid, and forgot. I keep coming back, though, to the tunnel in the dark, and the men in the shanties. It is very easy, standing in modern New York, to see the Croton system as a triumph of engineering, and it was one. John B. Jervis deserves his reputation. George Law earned his rise. The precision of that 13-inch grade held across 41 miles by hand is a genuine wonder. But every foot of that miracle was dug and blasted and bricked by men who lived in shanties and were paid $1 a day and were marched back to work by soldiers when they asked for that dollar not to become 75 cents. They drank bad water and breathed rock dust and set the black powder that could kill them in an instant. And they built the thing that gave a great city clean water and a future, and then they vanished from the story almost entirely. 3,000 or 4,000 of them, an army of Irish hands, remembered as a category and not as names. When I walk the old aqueduct trail now, where the tunnel still runs south under a quiet green path through the Westchester suburbs, I think about that. Under my feet is a brick channel that changed the course of a city's history, and it was laid brick by men whose graves, most of them, are unmarked, whose names are gone, who are remembered, if at all, as the Irish who dug it. You can go and find the traces of them if you want to. The green trail runs for miles through Westchester, and here and there along it, one of the old stone ventilator towers still stands among the trees, a quiet marker of the tunnel running beneath your feet. You can walk out across the High Bridge, restored now and open again, and stand on the arches George Law helped raise, high over the Harlem River. You can sit on the great lawn of Central Park, where the receiving reservoir once held its 180 million gallons, or on the marble steps of the library that stands where the old Egyptian reservoir stood at 42nd Street. Every one of those places is a spot where you can put your hand on this story. And at every one of them, the thing you are really touching, under the stone and the water and the grass, is the labor of men who were never named, whose work is still, this very minute, holding a city up. The water they delivered is still one of the reasons New York works. They gave it everything, including, some of them, their lives, and the city gave them back a wage it tried to cut and a militia when they complained. The least I can do, the least any of us can do, is to know that when we picture that 50-foot fountain leaping up in 1842, we are looking at the work of their hands, and to say so out loud. Because here's the thing I have come to believe. After walking that quiet trail and reading what little survives of them, the water is the monument. Not the fountain, not the high bridge, not the reservoir turned into a library. The water itself, the plain fact that it still comes, that 180 years later a New Yorker turns a tap without a thought and clean water runs, is the standing memorial to those men, renewed every single day, used by millions who will never know it is there for them. A stone monument you can walk past and ignore. But every glass of water drawn in that city is, in a sense, a small act of remembrance. Whether the one drinking it knows the name Croton or not, whether they have ever heard of the shanties, or the strike, or the men in the tunnel or not. The Irish who dug it wanted, I imagine, exactly what everyone wants. A wage they were not cheated of, a life not spent too cheaply to be seen. They mostly did not get those things. What they got instead, without ever meaning to, was a kind of immortality none of them would have recognized, dissolved into the water supply of the greatest city on the continent, present in every drop, and utterly, completely unnamed. They pulled a river to a dying city, downhill, by hand, and almost no one ever learned their names. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shoutout in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.